When it comes to adapting anime for an English-speaking audience, dubbing has always been a difficult process rife with compromise. As we mentioned in previous videos, matching the on-screen lip flaps is often made a priority, as poorly synced audio gives the impression of an amateur product, especially in the West. Therefore, it's important that other aspects of a dub's production come together in a way that ensures this does not happen. English dubs need dedicated adaptive scriptwriters who take the rough translation provided by a team of translators and figure out how to rewrite each line in English so that it fits within the lip flaps on screen, while actors are brought in to give believable performances through the process of automated dialogue replacement, or ADR for short. Granted, it's possible this won't be enough to satisfy some critics, who may try to downplay the specific nature of this process with various different versions of the same question. Can't you just edit the lip flaps themselves?
So, I can't breathe in space apparently.
If you were to use editing to change the amount of flaps, you can make the animation fit the English translation without potentially compromising the meaning of the original Japanese script. You'd be able to keep a perfect one-to-one translation, while also allowing actors so much more freedom with their performances, since they no longer need to conform to locked-in pre-established footage. After all, channels like Something Witty, Team 4-Star, and Gigguk edit lip flaps all the time for their videos, sometimes with as little as 1 or 2 editors.
I eat ass.
So surely major dubbing groups like Studiopolis, Funimation, and NYAV Post with their vast amounts of resources have no excuse comparatively.
And that should
I
be...
know what you'll say next.
About as easy as taking candy from a baby.
Some might bring this up as an obvious solution, but the reality is that people on both sides of this comparison will tell you that it's far from appropriate. Not only does it greatly underestimate the amount of work that such an endeavor would entail, but it also wrongfully assumes that an abridged series is accomplishing the same goal as that of an officially licensed uncut product.
Too many lies. Too many lies.
Unlike an official dub where the highs and lows of a pre-established franchise are adapted for the sake of reaching a wider audience, a common trend for an abridged series is to present those same elements as logical extremes for the sake of satirizing them. According to Scott KaiserNeko Frerichs, co-founder of Team 4-Star, part of this parody involves respecting the tone and intentions of the original, while subverting, exaggerating, and critiquing them. Even when the exact events of the stories themselves are kept intact, the original journey is made fun of or maybe even improved upon. Characters themselves are even completely revoiced with personalities that accentuate some of their best or worst personality traits, whether it be stretching Goku's simple-minded nature to the point of reckless abandonment,
We both know I don't know what that word means.
or even Yugi's ability to beat his opponent by virtue of the fact that he's the main character.
That's not how this works. We usually say we're going to play a card game, but then we spend the entire duel making wisecracks and referencing internet videos. Then at the end I win and people laugh and have a good time.
However, while abridgers have helped pave the way for some amazing opportunities and won the hearts of fans across the globe, ourselves included, there's still a very prominent group of people that have different feelings towards them for almost the exact same reasons. Even when everything is done out of respect, I don't think it's uncommon knowledge in the anime community that some Japanese companies don't have the best opinion of people who re-edit or repurpose their work online without express permission. Unlike fan-based parodies, official dubs need to be approved by the Japanese client, so it's up to them to decide which elements of the show are most important to maintain, in order to ensure what they consider valuable doesn't get left behind on the cutting room floor. Naturally, this will vary based on how a certain client wants their works to be represented, but over the years, there seems to have emerged a consistent enough pattern for us to observe what's usually prioritized for anime release nowadays. But before we could even get into what exactly that hierarchy of importance is,
It's time to duel!
4Kids was never in the anime business, ironically. The way I see it, they were in the... We are programming for our television block that they paid to license, kind of like infomercials at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. They just licensed the beginning of Saturday morning, but since they made like a $20 million investment to get that, they just had to program it. So they had messed around with Pokemon before, and that had been such a hit, they were like, oh, let's see if lightning strikes 13 more times. So they would just license stuff and put it out there as if it were original content. So they didn't try to honor the original Japanese, or, they'd change names, they'd have to rotoscope out stuff that wasn't going to pass American broadcast standards and practices, like cigarettes and guns. Mm-hmm. So they just, people think they just ran roughshod, and they did in the end, but it wasn't because they they just weren't in the business of dubbing anime. They were in the business of releasing their original content that used to be in Japan. Shh.
I'm sure we're all familiar with the handiwork of companies such as 4Kids, who are currently 4K Media, and their handling of specific franchises. But contrary to what some fans might have wanted, everything done to the final cut of these shows were almost never for the purpose of maintaining the original Japanese scripts, or giving actors more creative freedom when they're in the booth. Rather, they were done to make the shows more marketable to a very young American audience, who are assumed to have very little interest in the Japanese creator's original intent. And even though the days of these practices being the norm have long since passed, that doesn't mean they aren't still carried out today in select shows. From Digimon to Glitter Force, these titles are targeted towards very young children who are not considered a part of the core anime fanbase, and sometimes are motivated by tie-in merchandise that's brought over from Japan or newly produced locally. Now, the creation of that Americanized brand ironically wouldn't have been possible if these studios weren't allowed to make all these changes in the first place. But when it comes to editing lip flaps specifically, things don't seem to have been done nearly to the degree that some people might assume, the details of which we'll get into later on. So the main bulk of lip flap animation for anime follows what could be considered the rule of threes, with characters usually having at least 3 distinctly drawn mouth frames, open, half open, and closed, that can create a fluid talking animation. In most abridged content, these flaps can be looped, cropped out from various scenes, or even lifted from entirely different characters with a lot of recoloring and frame-by-frame repositioning for the sake of consistency.
Implant, newly drawn, implant, 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 newly drawn, altered.
After audio is recorded, these flaps are then added to pre-planned scenes or repurposed stills in a way that could be considered natural and somewhat similar to prelay. It can be a very simple yet time-consuming process that's mostly done with Photoshop or basic masking tools that can be found on most editing softwares, but everything ends up taking longer depending on what footage is being repurposed or the complexity of the new shot being created. It's usually something that works the best with shows like Dragon Ball, Yu-Gi-Oh, and others that already seem to capitalize on drawn-out dramatic shots, where only the mouths can be isolated with little interference. However, unlike a Bridge series where all these edits are done from scratch, the lip flap edits I was actually able to find in modern US television broadcasts were minimal at best to the point where I almost completely missed them. The reasons for changing flaps could vary between contexts or even companies. It might be to keep children as engaged as possible with quick and snappy dialogue that wasn't in the original, or maybe it could be to have a character stress something important like explaining how a card works in Yu-Gi-Oh! Regardless, the technical objective is to make the already existing mouth movements look more seamless, but even then, very little seems to actually be done.
I Exceed Summon! Witness the ascent of Raid Raptor Rise Falcon!
Did you catch the difference? Because the English version has the character continue talking across the cut, unlike the original, the localizer decided to alter the end of the first shot where the character is gritting his teeth with a new flap of him with his mouth open. Compare this example to something like Hellsing, which features much more detailed animation and movement. If the cameras or characters are constantly moving, then new flaps would need to be added or repositioned for every individual frame. And if there's some kind of obstruction over the characters' faces, like light filters or hair, then the process could take even more experimenting.
This made the process of editing the scene and I'm using professional lingo here, giant seething dick pain.
Abridged series editors can circumvent this well enough with more elaborate techniques, as well as redrawing flaps and other visual elements for scenes that originally were not there. However, content like this is a mode of entertainment that's come to be based around these types of audio and visual edits, so even when these changes are noticeable, you could argue that's part of the charm. Plus, if the creators are unsatisfied with a joke or particular direction, then they can always just not include it since they're the ones who make the final call. But that same logic can't apply when working with an officially licensed product, since even places like 4K don't have that type of freedom. To be more specific, they need to make sure their episodes meet broadcast requirements as well as be able to fit a prepaid time slot. Imagine if an episode of Yu-Gi-Oh became too long or too short after making all those edits. All that time, money, and effort poured in would end up being wasted because you'd no longer be able to take advantage of your platform. In an abridged series on YouTube, the writers and editors have much more autonomy over what they can or cannot do, so long as it doesn't violate copyright. And it's easy to imagine that fully fledged companies can also do almost whatever they want. However, now more than ever, official dubs don't have that same degree of freedom, especially those that seek to market foreign media while also trying to represent the desires of Japanese creators in another language. They need to work around what's technically possible on their platforms as well as what's allowed in the official licensing agreement, bound by limitations and standards that must be approved by the Japanese side, as there would be serious legal ramifications if an American company tried to alter it against contractual obligations. Even if a contract didn't state anything explicit about visual edits or recuts, because most anime dubbing is now less of a business that seeks to sell toys, foreign licensors wouldn't want to do anything that could potentially sour their relationship with the Japanese client, after being trusted extensively with how their projects are handled overseas. Naturally, it is an inevitability that some elements will have to change for a show to make the jump into a new language. But again, it's up to the Japanese clients to prioritize which elements are more important than others in a sort of hierarchy, even if the results don't unanimously reflect the desires of the entire Japanese crew. Now, as far as the ranks on this hierarchy go, for better or for worse, the script is pretty much at the bottom. Yep, while much of the English-speaking anime community will often say that the translated script is the most important element of an anime that shouldn't be altered at all for the sake of maintaining creative intent, when it comes to making the jump overseas, the script is evidently what's allowed to be changed the most. There'll always be people who insist that being faithful to the original script and giving the most expressive performance possible constitutes more artistic integrity than matching flaps, so it should be okay to just ignore them. But we sometimes take for granted just how different English and Japanese are as languages, with one being of West Germanic origin and the other being East Asian. Not only can their sentence structures differ drastically, but each language can sometimes take a significantly different amount of time, characters, and syllables to communicate the exact same idea.
I want to tell you I'm Al.
There's plenty of fear behind that smile.
The black dog, it's you.
That's not even accounting for the fact that a raw translation of the Japanese script would lead to awful, clunky dialogue that sounds nothing like a native English speaker, and the same goes for just reading the official subtitles out loud because they weren't written for that purpose. Some liberties can always be taken when a character's mouth is off screen or if they just don't have one to talk around, like Alphonse Elric from Fullmetal Alchemist or Kuro-sensei from Assassination Classroom. But timing still plays a huge factor in the natural flow of scenes that were originally made around the Japanese dialogue. Disregard that timing completely, and in the worst case scenario, you'd be left with a dub comparable to what happened with Sonic Adventure 2, where the English dialogue track seemed to deliver lines similar to the Japanese version with little regard for visual cues. The result was laughably disassociated mouth movements and characters responding to each other before they could even finish their sentences.
You're not even good enough to be
I'll make you eat those words!
Granted, there might be subtleties in the original script that must be preserved no matter what, and Japanese directors or producers will sometimes feel the need to provide their own script or guidelines. But there still needs to be some form of compromise for the sake of other elements that are higher up on this hierarchy. So then, what does the client see as more important than the script? Well, one thing might be the voices of the characters themselves. Because it's not very often that the Japanese cast is able to speak English or whatever other language the dub is being produced in, new actors with different voices will have to be acquired. This change is unavoidable, as sometimes the dub must be produced for a show to be sold in certain shops overseas. However, voices are still above the script on the hierarchy since it's more likely that the Japanese client will want to approve them. In certain cases, the dub actors chosen will be submitted to Japan for approval, and they'll sign off on whether or not an actor chosen is suitable to portray their characters in that language. This isn't always the case, but some standards need to be in place to ensure that a show will make sense to a new audience, fitting in with that country's media and understanding of certain tropes. This brings us to another level on the hierarchy that's above the script, specific terminology. These include things like the show's international titles, the characters' names, and proper nouns within the show's universe. Usually, Japan already knows what the English title of their show should be, with very little room for argument, which in some cases leads to interesting English titles, such as Knights with a possessive apostrophe and Magic. In the past, names and terminologies would be more flexible, as some dubbing companies would change them for the purpose of being more Americanized, or even at the behest of the licensors themselves. But nowadays, this is pretty much only allowed with children's shows and continuations of those older titles, with a few exceptions and inconsistencies. Even in Ghost Stories, where the US team was seemingly given full creative control over the script, the client was apparently still adamant about the characters' names and the way that the ghosts were defeated staying the same.
Maybe Momoko is right. You should go Gandhi and show kindness to your enemies, and by doing so, turn them into friends.
You're a fag, and he should join the football team.
Likewise, specific in-use terms like attack names and locations may sometimes carry over inconsistencies from older titles, but for the most part, they're usually preserved for modern dubs. They may stray from the Japanese translation if Japan insists on it, such as the case with 3D maneuvering gear becoming omnidirectional mobility gear in Attack on Titan, or if something really doesn't make sense when translated directly to English. An example of this was in Keijo, where the attack K acceleration was changed to W acceleration, due to the fact that the English word wedgie started with a W instead of a K, like the direct Japanese equivalent koikomi.
W acceleration! Activate!
One of the higher rungs on this hierarchy is the music and sound effects. Only rarely is background music ever cut or replaced nowadays, outside of those older dubbing practices mentioned earlier, even though exceptions still pop up every now and then, with the main thing changing between the Japanese and English release being the final sound mix itself, to account for the new dialogue track. Some effects might not even be provided by Japan, so things like voice filters must be recreated by the dub's audio team.
At least that's what it says on Wikipedia.
But otherwise, audio assets are almost always kept uncut, which means that editing the mouth flaps to make sentences last longer or shorter in the English version would also lead to the background music of the scene no longer syncing up with the action. Imagine a scene in My Hero Academia where You Say Run plays. This track has been made famous in the community for the exact timing of instrumental swells and impacts coinciding with on-screen actions. In fact, we have a full video on its impact ourselves. Editing lip flaps and shot lengths for the sake of making the script more accurate, or giving actors freedom with their timing would potentially be asking to throw all of this off. But hey, at least nothing would get lost in translation, right? The timing of cuts and the synchronicity of the music cues are art forms and languages that defy words. Should they really be the first things to bend? And that's not even taking into account the tippy top of the hierarchy of importance for anime, which is of course, the animation itself. There's a huge difference between footage that gets censored or cut for the sake of broadcast standards and hiring animators and artists to alter shots where a clean edit of a lip sync isn't possible. While it is true that Japanese animation has spearheaded some unique and compelling stories that people want to preserve as much as possible during the dubbing process, we can't forget that it's also a medium mostly defined by its visual inventiveness. The fast-paced action of One Punch Man, the detailed artistry of Makoto Shinkai films, the unique expressions of Hayao Miyazaki, or the constantly animated yet subtle body movements of Kyoto Animation. Even if it just started with small changes, they could end up snowballing into greater ones that could impact the artistry of the work as a whole. You'd ostensibly be creating an entirely different product that would need its own separate video track on the home release or online stream. Simply switching between the two audio tracks on the fly so English-speaking audiences can enjoy both would now be impossible. Studios would need teams to meticulously and seamlessly reanimate almost every other asset of a show just to make scenes accommodate more complicated lip flap edits. This process would also use up time and money that simply does not exist for anime dub productions, and workflow would sometimes need to change since not every show is animated the same way. Anyone who follows Abridged series creators will know that it takes even the best of them months to make a 10 or even 20-minute episode with all the extra editing they have to do, which would absolutely not jive well with the industry's more current initiative to give fans the dubs they want sooner, rather than months or even years down the road as it often used to be. Again, even if this quote-unquote 100% accurate script was the highest priority, then deliberately timed shots could end up flying past too quickly or lingering for too long. Even if everything was kept the same, and literally only the on-face animations were changed during the intervals in which dialogue is present, scriptwriters wouldn't be given complete freedom with timing even if it might be more than what's usually available. After all, this already happens in the dubs of certain video games. Japanese titles, including certain entries in the Tales of and Kingdom Hearts series, have mouth movements reanimated in cutscenes for their English releases. However, even in cases like this, we can see how adaptation would still be a necessity to produce an acceptable product, as accounting for the rest of the visual timing is important.
All for one,
and one for all!
If the delivery of this line felt unnaturally paced, it's because it was animated and edited to the original Japanese version of the phrase, which is
Minna wa hitori no tame ni. Hitori wa minna no tame ni.
a bit longer. Regardless, these mouth reanimations are done on the Japanese end to the game's CG models, and as far as we know, there's only been one instance in all of anime dubbing history that the Japanese requested and even assisted the English team with reanimating their show, the circumstances surrounding which were incredibly specific.
Go for it! Never giving up, never giving in. I'm with my best friends, and we're here to win!
The version of Yu-Gi-Oh Zexal we all know today was broadcast on Western television with the usual style of dub we've come to expect from 4K. However, there apparently does exist a 26-episode run of it recorded at Bang Zoom Entertainment. In March 2011, a lawsuit was filed against 4Kids Entertainment by TV Tokyo and Nihon Ad Systems, in an attempt to revoke the Yu-Gi-Oh license from the US company. And it was during the period of this lawsuit that Bang Zoom created this never-before-seen miracle dub, which we only know existed because there's footage of director Christy Reed recounting her experiences with the project online in great detail. Link in the description and the card above. But to summarize, the US team was granted the original After Effects assets of the show, and even though they had to teach their editor enough Japanese in order for him to use this version of the program, this potentially meant that the series could effectively be reanimated and retimed, with new music that could be scored to picture afterwards. It wasn't just mouth movements either. If they thought certain content was inappropriate, they could simply animate it out with their own team instead of resorting to awkward cutting and laughable paint jobs.
Mr. Pegasus would like to have a few words with you.
However, because the licensor solicited the international sale of Zexal while 4Kids still technically owned the license at the time, this was deemed as a breach of their contractual agreement, resulting in the Japanese companies paying 4Kids $8 million in settlements, and Bang Zoom's reanimated dub receiving no distribution whatsoever. It's hard to say if this new dub would have ended up being that much different from the one we ended up getting, but the possibilities do lead to several interesting questions. If this had gone through, would other anime dubs be able to make use of this workflow? If so, how would they make use of it? Would other Japanese clients be willing to let the foreign market modify their visuals in such a way? Or was this just with particular shows like Yu-Gi-Oh? Unfortunately, this is one of those examples where time will not tell.
So we go for it, Yu-Gi-Oh! Go for it! Don't ever give up! We gotta reach for the sky! Go for it, Yu-Gi-Oh!
It's easy to fantasize about the possibilities of re-editing mouth flaps to make anime more like prelay. After all, actors recording vocals with animation being produced around their performance is how voiceover is almost always done for the original language track of any given animated show in the English-speaking world, and there are many benefits that come from playing to that strength. But we think the people who insist that dubs should edit lip flaps aren't really aware that adapting scripts is already its own creative field, one where the writers, actors, and directors' jobs are to work within the restraints of the medium, not change that medium to make things easier for themselves. Even though online parody series are created in a way where both the writing and editing are allowed to reflect the different handling of a certain story compared to the original release, it's safe to assume that even abridgers themselves understand this, especially when you consider that many have experience doing official anime voiceover work. In fact, Team 4-Star, arguably the most famous abridging group that gets brought up in these examples, is currently producing an official dub for the Madhouse film Hells. And when asked how they were handling the product, Scott Frerichs again was the one to clarify that their usual editing process was never even an option to begin with.
While we always appreciate that people enjoy the methods and intent we employ in our videos, to assume the same process can be applied to official products is only seeing a fraction of the big picture. DVD and Blu-ray releases already struggle with storage issues, and to even begin to implement these concepts would necessitate a second video track in order to deliver both the original and the modified versions. Beyond that, these changes are intensely time-consuming. While lip flaps are only a single element of an abridged series, having to go through an entire 22-minute episode and modify these flaps appropriately would slow down official releases to a degree that would be unacceptable to modern audiences. Lastly, contractual and legal obligations regarding the alteration of material licensed by these companies is, if not ironclad, then at the very least implicit with every acquisition made, bar special exceptions for products that are often otherwise considered marketing powerhouses. TLDR, it is not an option for anime, by and large, to be edited to this degree in ADR in this country or any other, nor will it likely ever be.
At the end of the day, the visual flow of everything is simply what the Japanese client cares most about when their shows go overseas, and the licensors are trusted to make that a reality. Through creativity, hard work, and intuition, some dubs are able to satisfy their lip flaps, while keeping their content thematically resonant and also allowing the acting to be genuine. It sure as hell isn't easy, and doesn't always turn out good results. But is it really worth tossing those possibilities out by hacking scenes apart and putting them back together under the delusion that adaptation should not occur? If you ask us, that's a far more efficient route to misrepresenting the product than only changing the dialogue track. Granted, most of the examples we brought up in this video represent the majority of cases, as there will always be exceptions. Depending on the scenario, the client might allow music, types of voices, character names, and the precious script to change, as long as it meant that foreign audiences were seeing the beauty of their animation the way they want it to be experienced.
It was almost like
seeing something out of a dream. Nothing more or less than a breathtaking view.
The art of adaptation simply demands a new script, new actors, and new creative teams to bring it all together, so that non-Japanese audiences can enjoy anime in a similar way, with both an English and Japanese language track as watchable options. And besides, if what us foreigners want is for anime dubs to be as pure to the original creator's vision as possible, then why would you want to change all these other elements of the anime anyway?
Hey guys! Can someone help me up? I'm stuck! Seriously!